Welcome to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds, featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I am your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations and to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Maybe you've been listening for a while, or this is your first episode. If you like what you hear, would you do us a favor by rating and reviewing us on iTunes? This is a fantastic way to tell us you enjoy what we are creating. Also, if you want more MTSS resources, sign up for our weekly newsletter using the link in our show notes, and check out our website for all the blogs and guides you would ever need about MTSS. School safety is among one of the biggest concerns of parents and educators, and we know that a student being safe at school is paramount to learning. So we thought we would bring on some experts on the topic of school safety and restorative practices. Many of us educators might think that the idea of restorative practices sounds nice, but does it actually make a difference? Today on the podcast, we have Sherwin Patton, Co-Executive Director of Life Anew Restorative Justice, who is involved in projects all over Texas and the U.S. to enhance school safety, Brian Clausen, Program Manager of the Texas School Safety Center, and to lead the conversation is Trudy Bender, our Senior Manager of Thought Leadership here at Branching Minds, who has lots of experience in restorative practices, so I'll let her fill you in. But welcome. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and I'm excited to hear more about restorative practices. So Trudy, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
All right, so let me introduce. Today we have Sherwin Patton. He helps guide individuals and communities, including school staff, students, parents, community volunteers, to engage with each other in intentional conversations. I've worked with Sherwin since 2015, and he's one of the most invested individuals I've seen in actually doing the real work of building community. And it's not unusual to find him with a trail of young adults that he is mentoring and helping build a better life. And so it has been my privilege to work with him for 7 years in a school district setting and to really see up close and personal what an incredible difference restorative practices can make when they're integrated into a multi-tiered system of support. Brian Clausen is currently the Program Manager of Curriculum and Instruction at the Texas School Safety Center. He's a believer and a practitioner of building campus cultures that focus on the well-being and connectedness of every child in an effort to prevent hopelessness, unrealized potential, and preventing school violence. And that idea of preventing hopelessness is so central to who Brian is. You'll hear that come out as well. And I'm Trudy Bender. I've worked as a teacher, school psychologist, district administrator, addressing big behavioral problems, high discipline rates, disproportionality, and came to restorative practices in 2015 as one of the tools that we would use to help address those issues, which we did. So I'm a restorative discipline facilitator and have worked on the ground with this issue for many years as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and dive into our content. We're going to talk about building a restorative ecosystem, interrupting the pathway to violence, making restorative practices practicable. So as we get into it, I'm just going to share real briefly what are restorative practices. So I like to describe restorative practices in 3 ways: a set of tools or skills that help people build and maintain relationships with one another. It's a structure for meaningful conversation where every voice is valued. And that's where that whole circle idea comes in. You won't be involved in restorative for very long without hearing about this circle structure that's really central to restorative practices. And that circle structure provides a place for every person to kind of be on an equal plane and really share and listen from the heart. It's also a way of being with a relational focus and problem solving that really makes a difference as we look for root causes, not just consequences. So that's an overview of what restorative practices are. And then I wanted to give just a real quick introduction to multi-tiered systems of support. When that framework is applied to behavior, we call that positive behavior interventions and supports. I know that's a lot of acronyms. We won't do a lot more acronyms today, I promise, but I wanted to make sure that you understood what is MTIS, SS, and PBIS, along with restorative practices. And this is just to give you a picture right up front of how your restorative practices can be integrated into your multi-tiered systems of support. So at the tier 1 level, we're talking about community building circles that everyone participates in, especially the adults. Your adults also need to create community with each other in order to really be effective as educators. And then as well as connecting with kids and helping kids connect with each other. Those more informal check-ins, leadership opportunities, those are some ways that school-wide at the tier 1 level restorative practices can be integrated. And I'll say that without that kind of basic foundation, it's really hard to get success with the other kinds of restorative practices at the tier 2 and the tier 3 level. At tier 2, this involves restorative conversations, plan discussion. It's a way of interacting with students that makes sure that we're hearing their voices and working to solve problems with them, not just for them. Harm repair circles, small group supports like that circle you just saw in the previous slide. That would be a small group support. It's on a specific for a specific group of students on a specific topic that they were working on. And then finally at tier 3, this would be circles of support and accountability for kids who are really struggling and need a lot of additional support. Re-entry circles for kids who are coming back from an alternative education placement. And those are some of the most meaningful experiences that I've had with restorative practices, and often make a huge difference in the lives of students. The recidivism rate for kids who've had that kind of experience and have that kind of support, in my experience, has been a lot lower. And that includes wraparound service coordination, a lot of individualization. So that's to give you an overall picture of MTSS and restorative practices. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about a restorative ecosystem with Sherwin. So Sherwin Patton is with us. Sherwin, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you love to talk about a restorative ecosystem. So tell us a little bit about what that means and what kind of lessons you've been learning as you help implement restorative practices around the state and around the country.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, Trudy, for the opportunity to even be here. And when we think about a restorative ecosystem, it really goes back to the roots of restorative practices or peace circles or talking circles. When you think about the gift that we've been given, these peace circles, it comes from indigenous people of North America. And so the whole concept was that when there was a need in the community, then the community came together in order to be able to address that need. And that included the need to repair harm when harm happened. And also it meant as well meeting those practical needs that everyone has. And so when we think about a restorative ecosystem, it's including those who are within our community that can help us in terms of our basic needs and also being able to address the more pressing needs when there's a crisis involved. And so when we think about our village or our restorative ecosystem in our community, it all begins with asking a question. I need to ask my question of myself, who do I need to invite to help us to problem solve together? And so when I think about on a school campus, one of the things that is always needed is parents that are part of the restorative ecosystem. That may also include the school counselor that's a part of the restorative ecosystem. And of course, the teachers within the classroom that need to be a part of that restorative ecosystem. And the person that everybody loves on the school campus is the person that works in the cafeteria because they feed everybody. So that's a part of our restorative ecosystem. The janitorial staff might be a part of our restorative ecosystem as well. And also when we think about schools that have school-based law enforcement on the campus, that is a part of our restorative ecosystem. All of these people are stakeholders on the campus that help to build the village. And so a restorative ecosystem is all the people that need to connect, contribute in order to make sure that we have a community that's based upon relationships and is intentional about healing in relationships.
How has partnering with school-based law enforcement and Texas School Safety Center been helpful? What kinds of things are you seeing through that partnership?
Well, one of the more practical ways that we've seen it help. Enforcement has had a basic understanding of restorative practices and how that's helped us in terms of preventing escalation on the campuses. And when there has been an occurrence on the campus, how they've actually helped to be a part of the healing. I'll give you an example of that. There is a school district in Texas, Klein Independent School District, right outside of Houston, where they actually chose to implement at Tier 1 restorative practices. And they're part of engaging with the administration at the school to be in restorative circles with the students. And so there's a relationship there. And so when redirection does need to happen, they have relational capital to be able to talk to the students. So it's not a stranger coming in and talking to me. And so that's helped. And then in another practical way, we just dealt with a crisis on one of the campuses here in Austin, Texas. And it was a tragic death of a student. But the school-based law enforcement is a part of the training team for the Texas School Safety Center. In fact, he's the chief for police for Austin Independent School District. And because he has a knowledge of restorative practices and his team on the campus has a knowledge of it, then they're part of that healing process as we support the kids on the campus. So not only are they willing participants in circles, but they also understand the language that has to be used, that this is not a transactional relationship, that they have to really be aware of the emotional toll that it's taken on the entire community. And having school-based law enforcement coming in with that lens helps them to be a part of the healing and not unintentionally cause harm.
Mm. Say a little more about that lens, how the lens can change for our school-based law enforcement. And Brian, you might want to chime in on this too. I know this is something that you've talked a lot about.
So I'll kick us off quickly, and then I'll pass it over to Brian. When we talk about a lens, oftentimes when we see our roles, we are kind of blinded by our roles because we know what needs to happen on the campus. Like for instance, school-based law enforcement's need is for them to be able to protect the campus, and so they can see things through that one lens, and oftentimes not be able to see that part of protection is also about how they communicate with children on their level. And so when we're talking about having a restorative lens, it's about the language that we use in order to engage young people on their level. It's about them being able to understand what we're trying to convey to them. And so that's not necessarily something that we come into the space knowing. It's almost like speaking a different language. We have to learn how to speak that language. And so that's for everybody on the campus. When we start learning the common language of restorative practices and how do we connect with students, it helps us not to confuse our students. And I'll pass it over to Brian.
Yeah, I think, when you look at it from the lens of if we all just stayed in the lane of our role, so a police officer just only focused on identifying and reacting to breaches of the peace, a math teacher only teaching math, a social studies teacher only teaching social studies, but never getting relational outside of that, it tends to feel transactional, right? We can't do safety and security. We can't do math. We can't do geography or history without that relationship approach. Now, in our world at the Safety Center, people worry about, well, is law enforcement, does that mean they're doing administrative duties? No, we're not asking law enforcement to take over administrator duties, such as implementing discipline or an administrator taking on law enforcement breach of peace issues. But we are asking people, to do your role successfully, which is inclusive of school-based law enforcement, is that you need to have the relationships. And if we're going to be a campus that utilizes restorative practices, one of the key foundations, if not the whole thing, is about relationships. And sometimes it's establishing relationships or it's repairing relationships. And so really looking at everyone, not just law enforcement, to say, you serve a certain function on this campus, but you're a human being, and we're all a part of that ecosystem, whether it's in one classroom, a grade level, or the whole campus. We all are interconnected, and if we need to leverage that to be able to prevent harm and to repair it when it's applicable, when it's appropriate.
So that kind of leads us into this interrupting the pathway to violence. So Brian, I want to and have you walk us through a little bit about how restorative practices help interrupt this pathway to violence. So you might need to just introduce this idea a little bit and talk about
But in the 86th legislative session here in Texas, there was legislation in Education Code 37.115 that requires every campus to be served by a threat assessment team. And so you guys might be thinking, why are we talking threat assessment all of a sudden when we're talking about restorative practices? If your campus has completely bought into threat assessment, which is, in all honesty, is a completely 100% reactive process, right? The team doesn't activate until a threat has been made or an act of violence has occurred. But what we need to do is, what that reaction lends us to analyze is what caused this act of violence or this threat. What was the root cause of it? And working backwards to find that root cause, we look at the pathway to violence. And what we know about the pathway to violence is people just don't snap. It's over time. They display information, it's called leakage, that they have a grievance, there's something going on social emotionally, maybe mental health wise even, and those things are going to be leaked throughout the pathway to violence. And so if we are attuned to the interconnectedness of just each other in the community, we can see those things manifest along the pathway to violence. And so if someone has a grievance or they've been bullied, this root cause of what pushed them to this place to act, either in a threat or a violent way, they start at a place where they have ideations about how can I solve this when it hasn't been solved in other ways. They begin to plan, so that's where you see like the hit list. The preparation is gathering weapons, maybe walking through the plan, practicing it, target practice. We could go on forever about this, but eventually they implement, right? This is that snapping moment where the threat or the action takes place. And what we know is this is over a period of time, and there's a lot of information that this person who has this grievance has been sharing with people, either in writing or verbally, or just how they show up to school, they look different. Restorative practices, you soon realize, is a reactive and preventative tool to the pathway to violence. If we have a student who's on the pathway to violence and we see someone acting this way and we are using restorative conversations, we can identify that there is a student that may have a grievance that may be in that process of going to making a threat or committing an act of violence. What we learned over the years is that it's not just this reactive piece of identifying kids who are on the pathway, but how can we also prevent that cycle? So not just breaking it, but preventing it. And so then we realized restorative practices, if implemented within your ecosystem, and again, at that classroom level, grade level, campus level, your ecosystem just needs to be scaled up. If you're having these conversations, checking in with kids, building those relationships, you can prevent the hopelessness that gets people on the pathway to violence, right? And so this is a great way to reduce hopelessness, which we know is a high indicator of someone creating harm to themselves or others or both. And so at the Safety Center, we've taken a very backwards approach to this, right? We recognize that there's a pathway. So let's identify kids on the pathway. Well, we've learned a lot about identifying the pathway. Let's start talking about how we prevent the pathway through creating more hopeful, human, interconnected connections and relationships. And that's your ecosystem, right? Now, restorative practices isn't appropriate for all situations. It's not a replacement for discipline. The way we see it at the Safety Center, I think Sherwin will agree, is that it's in relationship to equitable, progressive discipline when appropriate, including involving law enforcement when there is a criminal act or a breach of the peace. But that doesn't prevent the campus from still having those restorative pieces, those conversations, to saying, you know, this student most likely is going to come back to us. So I know in threat assessment, many times we think about the worst case scenario. That worst case scenario, that kid most likely isn't coming back to campus because there's adjudications that are taking place. But 95% of your threat assessments are going to be appropriate for a reactive conversation using the restorative conversation to see if there is a way to extinguish the grievance the student has, or at least move them past it and start processing it if they can't resolve it because it has already happened. But then even further, if we know the anatomy of the pathway to violence, let's just avoid the entire anatomy of itself and start building these conversations into our daily routines to engage everyone. And this works for everyone, right? This is working for with your custodial staff. This is for your lunchroom folks. This is for your paras. It's for your substitutes. It's for everyone. If you have contractors on campus, it's for them too. It's having that shared language and that shared expectation of how we talk to each other, and recognize that there may be some growing stress and disconnect in our students and each other. And we know that's where that little ball of hopelessness starts to grow, when we're not able to connect and we're not able to get our grievances addressed in an appropriate and timely way. So, you know, our world at the Safety Center is very tied into, you know, looking at acts of violence and breaking the pathway. But over those 4 years since the 86th legislative session, we've really moved to a place of how are we engaging campuses to start this conversation so that we're not breaking the pathway, but we're preventing the pathway.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts that just came as you were sharing that. In my experience with restorative, one is that when we had that kind of language and relationships built on a campus, and I'm thinking of a couple of specific incidents, it wasn't just that the student who might have been on this pathway to violence had connection. It was also all of the kids around that student felt comfortable, felt safe to go to someone on the campus and say, hey, you need to know that this person is talking this way, or you need to know that this is going down at this time and in this place. And those are conversations that would not have happened if we had not taken the time to build relationships with trusted adults on that campus. So that was one thing that came to mind. Another thing that came to mind was our experience in a middle school of opening it up for children to come before school to meet in restorative circles every day. And we ended up having like standing room only for these middle school students who were coming of their own desire before school. And what really struck me about that when I had the chance to participate is that often the students passed the talking piece. They didn't even share anything, but at the end of the circle would say, I feel like you know, this is a place where I can be myself and where I can be heard. And I always would think, you didn't say anything. How can you say that you were heard? But just the fact that they had a place to sit, they felt like they had a place at the table, that there were people there who were open and willing to hear them, made such a difference for those students. And so this idea of preventing the pathway to violence by preventing that hopelessness, I think is so powerful. And so if your district is seeing a really high level of behavioral threat assessments, it might be time to take a step back and see what's going on underneath. And I know, Brian, you've had some experience with that as well, right?
Yeah, definitely when I was a principal, for sure. And it really does set the tone for the climate and culture of the campus. And like you said, like all those kids that show up, even if they didn't say anything, it was being modeled for them by watching other students talk with other students and other adults, that this is a safe place to share, you know, certain feelings and things that are going on. Kids see everything that we do as adults, right? They see the good, the bad, and the ugly, the mistakes we make when we nail it. And so just even knowing that those opportunities are there and that people can express themselves impacts everyone, even if they're not participating in it. Recently, we heard this story about a kid who was displaying images of guns on his computer, in his writing, even on his clothing. And he was just disciplined for this. This is against school code. You need to go home and change. There was never a conversation of why. Why is this happening? It could have been something as simple that he's just fascinated by them, and there's a gun culture at home, and things are okay. There's parameters at home for this. But there's a good chance that there aren't parameters, safety parameters for this child, and that there's something deeper going on. It manifests recently in that finally this kid hit his breaking point, and when he was sent home to change, he's a high school student, he came back with a gun. Luckily, he was intercepted by school-based law enforcement as he entered campus. Someone alerted campus that there was a student with a potential weapon. But in talking to him, you hear he's struggling with a grievance that he feels went unheard by his family, by his peers, by folks at school. And so he felt like his only place to find safety for himself was to bring this weapon. Now, we could dissect the anatomy of that thinking and say that's completely incorrect, but he was using the tools that he knew. And in those conversations, we learned that if someone would have just stopped, he still needed to be disciplined. But if there was this hopeful conversation, creating connection to understand what was going on, and that's that restorative combo we're talking about, the kid could have been taken off the pathway to violence, right? So he was already on it. And if we would have just tweaked our response to not just be discipline only, we would have learned a whole slew of information as to where that kid is at, and that he was open to adults leaning in and intervening with him.
Yeah. Sherwin, what would you like to add here? I know you're involved not just with the prevention, but all the way through. You've even worked with inmates in prison and really working not just at the school level, but at the community level to prevent violence. So tell us a little bit about your work with the wider ecosystem.
Yeah, so when we think about community violence intervention, one of the things that we're intentional about doing is finding what we call trusted messengers. And these trusted messengers for us work on our team as coordinators on the campuses to have those conversations Brian was speaking about with our students prior to them doing any type of egregious act. And I'll give you a quick outcome that we had just this last school year. As a result of having those conversations with people who are demonstrating, behavior that would tell us that maybe they're a threat for having being violent or having a gun, we had 5 guns that were removed from students that did not need to have them. And that conversation was really challenging to have, but the trusted messengers had the relational capital with those students, and it really helped the students because they were looking for a way out. But oftentimes when Brian was talking about that sense of hopelessness, it seems like you have no way out when you have no one that you trust to talk to. And so one of the things that we have been really intentional about is selecting people that have similar life experiences that they've lived through, and now they're making different choices in life. And those people make the best trusted messengers on school campuses. And also they're people who have turned the corner in terms of equipping themselves. So they've now received some type of credentials that allows them to be able to serve as trusted messengers on the campuses as well. And then there's in terms of community violence intervention, there's a place where restorative practices and therapy meet. And we've coined this new position as restorative therapist. And so you have people who are equipped to handle some of those deeper issues that we all deal with in life, and they understand the restorative process. So they're able to utilize restorative practices in group settings, and they're also able to do individual therapy. And so they help us in terms of being able to even do assessments and for students and being able to get the students' needs met. And so I think that community violence intervention is important because there is a bridge between what happens in community and what happens in schools. And that bridge is called communication. We have to be able to talk to people who are involved in law enforcement in the community. We also have to be willing to talk to people and hold events in the community where the children live. And then we also have to be able to identify with some of the struggles that our children have in community. And that can only be communicated to us by people who live in those communities. So that's the way that we kind of approach violence in our schools. We do community violence intervention. So we take a holistic approach and address the entire ecosystem instead of being one-dimensional.
Well, the idea that something would just be contained within the school just isn't true, right? Like kids are bringing stuff in from the outside. You have family members involved. You have all kinds of outside influences going on that absolutely impacts what's happening in the school and vice versa. So this idea of creating an ecosystem is so important.
Can I add something to that too, real quickly? Because one of the things that we did over the summer, and it was a result of what the trusted messengers were seeing. There were spots in our community where violence is just prevalent. I mean, and there's a lot of gang activity and beefs that impact the school that come from those communities. And so over the summer, rather than trying to have an attractional approach where we bring kids to the school, we had multiple events during the summer, and we interacted with the students in that community over the summertime. And so when school started, we had never lost connection with the students. And so when they came to school, it was easy for us to have conversations with them because there was not a reconnection that had to happen. And the other part of that is that they introduced us to adults in the community that could help us with serving the kids. And I think that's just so important in terms of being able to identify who your ecosystem is. So we have to think strategically, not only about the things that we do on our school campuses, but how do we meet the children and the adults where they are in their own communities.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. And I want to hit one of the Q&A questions that Martha has. So when do you hold these, right? Like, I think Sherwin just cleared up the what and the why, but like, when do you do that, right? And I've been in places in my practice as an administrator where it felt like it was something that we had to schedule into our day, and that's the only way we can do it, right? And then it gets into the piece of, well, I have to teach. What about my teaching minutes? This should be a practice that it's a check-in as kids come into the classroom, maybe stopping class when there's conflict, but you've agreed this is what we do when conflict reaches or interruptions reach a certain level in our classroom. We will stop and talk about this when it's impacting the class. It could be stopping a kid in the hallway. It could be setting up time before or after school, at lunch. I know in our practice, we had it. It needs to become a part of how you interact with people. And the more it becomes a part of how you talk to people, how you connect to them, and the language you use, it's no longer about when you do it, but about that natural conversation that you have, just stopping to make time for the conversation, as opposed to feeling like, well, when do we do it? And we need to schedule it. It's when we have these types of issues, we all agree we're going to stop and talk about it. And if we don't have the time now, we agree that we're going to find time in the near future to have this combo, because we don't want either of us to feel disconnected or let that hopelessness grow or take root. And so the more it becomes we've had to build it into, when I was a principal, it was part of our classroom constitutions. When we have these types of conflicts that we all agree are disruptive, we're going to respond in a restorative way at a level 1 and level 2 and potentially level 3 level. And again, not replacing discipline, but along the way, we are always going to become from a restorative lens, because we know that we don't want to grow hopelessness, and that if there is harm done, that we do need to have a conversation about it if all parties are willing to, right? Restorative doesn't work in all situations because it does take consent of folks who are part of the issue to be involved. But I don't want to talk so much about when, but more about that mindset of if this is how we're all thinking and we build it into our values, it becomes a part of every conversation that you have throughout the day.
And the only thing I would add to that as well, value who you have on your campus that are the adult supports. And what I mean by that is we oftentimes overlook the people who have the most communication with our students and the adults. The janitorial staff and the front office staff, the cafeteria staff, they have a lot of communication with the students, and their relationship with them is very different than the relationship that the teachers must have inside of the classroom, in terms of the fact they're not necessarily responsible for for teaching them. And so I think that as we think about our restorative ecosystem on the campus, then we have to make sure that we're taking care of valuing all the relationships that the adults have on the campus. So let me rewind real quick, and I'll be brief. We do circles with adults so that the adults are not only prepared, but they're in a space mentally to be able to handle some of the challenges that the students may have. I want to give a real quick shout out to a lady named Veronica Silva, and she works with restorative practices with the district in Austin, and then also a lady named Rebecca Aguilar, who is a restorative coordinator for us on that campus, who does not work for the district. She works for Life Anew. Both of them work together to do circles for the adults on the campus, to help to support them so that they can support the adults. So I think we have to think about how we use our PLCs to connect the adults on the campus, allow them to have an outlet, and then also allow them to support one another to go out and do these circles or have these restorative chats with the students on the campus.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I found in my experience that those what we would maybe say auxiliary staff members and our paraprofessionals are some of the very, very best at connecting with these kids. And they're often that community connection as well. These are folks who live in those neighborhoods. They know the grandmas and the aunts and the uncles and the brothers and the sisters. And so involving those folks is really critical to having a great restorative ecosystem on your campus. And I know we're going to get questions about the practical part of this. And there's so much to cover in this short time, but I'm going to go ahead and just take a couple of minutes to talk about the practical aspects of restorative, because, it is all great to talk about it, but the day-to-day life of school is really challenging to sometimes figure out how are we going to make this work in the day-to-day life of a school. And I just wanted to address it very directly. This is something that we do in our training on restorative practices with educators. I share this information with them about consequences because it comes up all the time with restorative. We want to say it again very clearly. Consequences are appropriate. Students need to learn that there is a cause and an effect in life, but they are not sufficient to repair relationships or to prevent a reoccurrence. If you want safer schools, you've got to help your kids bridge their way back to restoring relationship and building a connection with their school. So, punishment is the weakest tool we've got in terms of preventing reoccurrence. So consequences are important. They're going to be there. They're not going away. And then we have these behavior interventions. Maybe your school has tier 2 and tier 3 behavioral intervention programs, which help address function of behavior and why students are behaving the way that they do, which is all super important. But what we really need and where you really see change for students is in that restoration where they start having positive social relationships. And then they have that motivation to change their behavior and they have that hope that it can be different. So we want to be really clear about that. And I'd like to talk directly also about making some things practicable. Practicable means feasible. How do we even get this done? And I've got some information about a project that Texas did where they were implementing restorative practices kind of broad scale across the state. And they did a survey of the school administrators that were involved in that project and asked for those who were more successful with restorative practices, what helped you be successful? What made the difference? And I'd like to share the results of that with you. So participants were asked to indicate conditions at their school that helped them facilitate, and these were the most common. The number one most common thing they said was having an established student support system already. If you have a system in place that helps you support adult practices and provides the data you need to set goals and see if you're meeting your goals, if you have organization around the way that you're providing behavior intervention, social emotional learning, school-based mental health, you're going to be more successful with restorative practices. And then administrators and staff that were open to innovation and change, that was important. Funds to support a dedicated restorative practices coordinator. I know that that's not always possible. I was fortunate to have some full-time dedicated restorative facilitators in my district, but not every campus had one, and we worked with a wide variety of staffing, and that's more than we can go into in the space of this webinar. We do get into that a little bit in the training that we're offering through Life New and Texas School Safety Center. And then external pressure from the community to say, we've got to do something different. For campuses that have really high discipline rates and disproportionality rates, that pressure helps districts figure it out. Like, we've got to do something differently. So what are we going to do? And I will just put out there that a strong MTSS PBIS framework makes this work possible, because you're tying it to an organizational system that's helping everyone get on the same page. I'm going to give you my top 3 tips for restorative practices as a district administrator. And then we're going to open it up to questions. So my first tip is tie initiatives to your MTSS framework. So take the interventions that you already have, take the systems you have in place already for training and supporting teachers, for supporting your students, and tie your restorative initiatives into that framework. And so that you're all speaking the same language. And then we're going to reiterate this again. Do not think that restorative practices are a silver bullet to fix broken systems, to replace good classroom management, intervention programs, consequences. It is not. In fact, teachers who really struggle with classroom management are going to struggle in implementing restorative practices. So make sure that you have your good behavior intervention, your PBIS systems in place, and you will have a lot easier time implementing restorative practices. And then finally, I've said it, I'm going to say it again, restorative is real world social skills training, way better than a worksheet, way better than watching a video. Learn how to get kids in a circle, talking to each other, listening to each other, learning how to hear another person's perspective, learning how to control yourself. It's some of the best real world social skills training you can get. Especially in building empathy, which we know for our kids, so many of our students are lacking empathy. And so this process, this structure of restorative practices can help build empathy and can really prevent that hopelessness. If you want to learn more, and I know that you will, I wanted to give you some information for how you can reach out to Life Anew, reach out to Texas, even if you're not a Texas school. TXSSC has so many resources. They've got a blog, they've got a podcast, they've got some toolkits, some things that can really help you with your behavioral threat assessment and creating a safer school. And then, of course, here at Branching Minds, we would love to schedule a demo with you and talk about how we can help you support your students and support your teachers with great restorative practices. Thank you so much to Sherwin and to Brian for all of the wisdom that you shared with us today. We wish you all the best at the beginning of this school year for a wonderful school year. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Branching Minds.